Our story begins in the year 1451. The future Queen of Spain, Isabella of Castile, is born, as well as Amerigo Vespucci in Italy, after whom the Americas will be named, and Christopher Columbus. The son of Christopher Columbus, Fernando Columbus, would later write in his biography that Christopher was very pleasant to the members of his household, though with a certain gravity. He loved nature, sitting outdoors and listening to the little birds and watching the fields. Fernando, unlike his father, was born in 1488 in what would become the Kingdom of Spain, though Spain was not exactly a unified kingdom yet. The marriage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand in 1479 would eventually result in the Kingdom of Spain, but for now it was a collection of smaller kingdoms. Christopher had been born into a fast-changing, tumultuous world. Constantinople would fall 2 years after his birth in the year 1453. The Ottoman invasion of this ancient city would have a profound influence over the course of Christopher's life. Founded in 330 during the reign of Emperor Constantine, who was the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantinople would remain the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century. Constantinople was in fact named after Emperor Constantine, and from the mid-5th century to the early 13th century, it was the largest and wealthiest city in Europe. It was famous for architectural masterpieces, as well as the University of Constantinople, which was a place of learning and home to literary treasures from the 5th century, until being sacked in 1203, and again in 1453. The university also contained many of the remnants of the ancient Library of Alexandria, and had a total of 100,000 volumes of documents and literature. Constantinople was famous as well for its massive fortifications. It was, however, finally conquered by the Ottomans in 1453, after which it was renamed Istanbul, a name that it retains to this day. In 1451, when Columbus was born, Constantinople was perhaps the most important city in the world because of the trade route that it controlled, known as the Silk Road. Though the Silk Road continued to operate after the invasion of the Ottomans, Western European explorers were starting to investigate the possibility of cutting out the middleman, so to speak. They realized that they could cut out the Ottomans altogether by establishing their own trade routes by sea. It's commonly believed that the Ottomans either stopped the Silk Road or significantly raised prices, but this doesn't appear to have been an immediate cause for the interest in Western Europe to seek out other means of trade. The fall of Constantinople and the city's transformation into an Islamic capital was, however, an impetus for an increased interest in seafaring and navigation knowledge. Such were the state of things in 1453, when Columbus was 2 years old. He had been born in the Republic of Genoa, in modern Italy, to Domenico Colombo and Susanna Fontanarossa. His mother, Susanna, was from a wealthy Catholic family and had 5 children, the oldest of whom was Christopher, or Cristoforo. Domenico, his father, had been a weaver and apprenticed to the loom since age 11. He owned his own shop, selling cheese, alcohol, and wool, but he seems to have been a lazy worker. He was a bad provider for the family, though generally well-liked by members of the community. Faced with financial difficulty, his 2 oldest sons, Christopher and Bartholomew, abandoned their apprenticeship to the loom and went out to sea. Christopher wrote of his own life that he first went to sea at the age of 14. Despite coming from a lower middle-class family and needing to work during childhood, Christopher was passionate about the sea and claimed to have read as many books as he could about geography, history, philosophy, and other sciences. In his biography, written by Christopher's son Fernando, it's said that during one voyage, the crew on board a ship that Christopher was on began fighting with that of another ship. During the fight, a fire spread and the ship sank. Christopher, who ended up in the ocean, seized onto an oar in the water and floated to land. Despite this near-death experience, however, Christopher continued sailing, working as a business agent for wealthy families involved in trade. In 1479, he married Philippa Perestrello. Historians have speculated how Christopher, the son of a Genoese wool weaver, could have possibly married the daughter of a Portuguese knight. The answer appears to be that Philippa was already 25, old for an unmarried woman. Her mother was also a widow of little means and leaped at the chance of marrying her daughter to a young, seafaring man who had not asked for a dowry. Philippa's cousin, Raphael Perestrello, would later become one of the first Europeans to land in China in 1516 during the Ming Dynasty. Christopher's son Fernando writes that Christopher used to have long conversations with Philippa after attending Mass. They became friends and got married shortly afterwards. Philippa's father had been a talented seafarer. Christopher's mother-in-law discussed at length with Columbus that Philippa's father had been commissioned by the King of Portugal to sail and discover new lands. These stories apparently gave Christopher much pleasure. Fernando writes that Philippa's mother gave Christopher all of her husband's old writings and sea charts. Fernando also speculates that it may have been around this time that Christopher started to consider embarking on his own enterprise of discovery. 2 years after marrying Philippa, Christopher wrote to a Florentine astronomer named Paolo Toscanelli. Toscanelli, after receiving Christopher's letter, responded encouragingly and sent a copy of the map that he had formerly sent to the King of Portugal. He lived most of his life in Florence, with occasional trips to Rome, and entered into correspondence with scholars around Europe, though his writings have not been thoroughly researched. Yet he appears to have had close ties with some of the leading intellectuals of the day. Toscanelli was friends with Filippo Brunelleschi, the famous architect who finished the dome of the Florence Cathedral. He also knew Nicholas of Cusa, a Christian humanist philosopher who wrote short, metaphysical tracts on the nature of God. When Nicholas of Cusa was on his deathbed, Toscanelli traveled 120 miles from Florence to the remote city of Perugia to be with him. Toscanelli, along with his good friend Nicholas of Cusa, belonged to a network of Florentine and Roman intellectuals who sought out and studied ancient Greek texts, meaning that Toscanelli may very well have helped the Italian Renaissance to flower. For example, Toscanelli was said to have come into contact with the writings of Strabo, a Greek geographer from the 1st century BC AD. Strabo had traveled extensively in the ancient world and drew maps of his journeys. Christopher's correspondence with Toscanelli is likely to have had an enormous influence on the development of his ambitions. Though Christopher was a talented sailor and geographer, Toscanelli's maps and calculations must have strengthened his determination and increased his optimism. There were, however, mistakes in Toscanelli's understanding of the size of the Earth. He had miscalculated Asia as being 5,000 miles longer than it really was, and he also miscalculated the circumference of the Earth by 25%. This is one reason why Christopher, later, during his travels, believed until the end of his life that he had reached Asia instead of the Americas. If the Americas had not happened to be in Christopher's way, his crew likely would have depleted their store of food and starved to death somewhere in the vast and empty Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Americas were roughly halfway between Europe and Asia was lucky for him. Because Toscanelli was an intellectual, he was not only interested in the potential wealth that would come from the discovery of the new sea route to Asia. In his first letter to Christopher, Toscanelli writes that the Chinese have, in the past, shown kindness to Christians, and that their cities are worth seeking by the Latins. Quote, not only because great wealth may be obtained from it, gold and silver, all sorts of gems and spices, which never reach us, but also on account of its learned men, philosophers, and expert astrologers, and by what skill and art so powerful and magnificent a province is governed. Extract from First Letter of Toscanelli to Columbus. People had long been suspecting that the western oceans would lead not just to Asia but to undiscovered lands, though nobody knew for sure how large or numerous these lands were. Sailors exploring the Atlantic Ocean had written of finding carved pieces of wood on the ocean. During particularly strong winds, fallen trees would wash up on the shores of the Azores, but the trees were of a kind that did not grow there. On another occasion on the island of Flores, 2 dead bodies washed up. They appeared to be a sort of people that none recognized. Fernando writes that his father would often describe these stories to him. The sea in that day was strange, dangerous, and mysterious. There were many odd stories, however, that did not seem to equate with a reason. Sailors would describe unusual islands appearing during storms, but later, when they tried to find those islands in better weather, they were nowhere to be found. Christopher appears not to have taken much stock in such anecdotal evidence. He took advice from serious intellectuals like Toscanelli. He also highly prized ancient learning and believed that the Greeks knew many things about the world that the Europeans did not. He would be inspired, for example, by stories from Aristotle's book, On Marvelous Things, which showed islands on various charts that the Europeans had no knowledge of. There was a story in this book that Carthaginian merchants had sailed over the Atlantic to a very fertile land. Ancient knowledge from Greek philosophers was becoming a source of authority for these explorers. Though Toscanelli did not travel extensively himself, he was a man of immense curiosity and activity in Florence. He observed Halley's Comet, of which he made notes, and pierced a hole in Brunelleschi's famous dome of the Florence Cathedral. The reason for this hole was to create a gnomon, or a projection of sunlight through the dome of the cathedral onto the cathedral floor, 91 meters below. The 1470s appears to have been a decade of curiosity, learning, and business venture for Christopher. He had established himself as a relatively successful seafaring business agent, married a woman, Philippa, and entered into correspondence with intellectuals about the feasibility of sailing west to reach Asia. By the end of the 1470s, Christopher was based out of Lisbon, where his brother Bartholomew lived and made maps. His first son, Diego, was born at the end of the decade, either in 1479 or 1480. Between 1482 and 1485, Christopher made many trips along the west coast of Africa, but in 1484, Christopher returned home after receiving news that his wife had died. Upon learning of her death, Christopher settled her estate and took Diego with him to Castile in 1485. The unification of Spain, however, was still an ongoing process as they attempted to drive out the final strongholds of the Muslims, known as the Moors. Isabella was very religious, but also very politically active. Her brother Henry had been the king of Castile prior to her, and he had spent a great deal of money while doing very little to enforce the kingdom's laws. It was said that murder, rape, and robbery went unpunished. When Isabella finally came to power, her first major reform was to form a police force. The police force was made up of locals and paid for by a tax. Isabella traveled to several cities and towns to ensure that the police force was being effectively implemented. Her other reforms were of a financial nature. For example, during the reign of her brother Henry, the places that were allowed to mint money increased from 5 to 150. There was little to no oversight, and much of the coinage produced in these places was nearly worthless. Isabella established a monopoly over the royal mints and set a legal standard to be met for the quality of coinage. Because of this, much of the public had great confidence in Isabella's ability to handle the kingdom's finances. In general, Isabella was more active and influential on a local level than King Ferdinand, especially as their reigns progressed. During their marriage, a wedding contract had been signed stipulating that Isabella would retain absolute power in Castile. Nearly everything that King Ferdinand wanted to do required her permission. Ferdinand was by no means an uninvolved ruler, though. He played a role in virtually every political alliance on the European continent. Isabella had in fact been betrothed to Ferdinand since the age of 6. At the time of her birth, she was second in line to the throne after her brother Henry IV, who would eventually reign before her and put the country into the mess that it was in when she finally became queen. Henry was crowned in 1453 when Isabella was 2 years old, the same year that Constantinople fell. She and her brother Alfonso were placed in Henry's care and moved away by Henry to a castle where they lived poorly. Isabella received a practical religious education, which deeply influenced her for the rest of her life. Later, when Henry's wife, Queen Joan, was about to give birth, Isabella was allowed to move in with the queen and live with her, where her condition greatly improved. Her education also received more attention. She was instructed in reading, spelling, writing, grammar, history, arithmetic, art, chess, dancing, embroidery, music, and further religious studies. She was not, however, allowed to leave under her brother Henry's orders. Around this time, a rumor began to spread that Henry's daughter, Joanna, had been the result of an affair between the Queen and another nobleman. To this day, it's unknown whether there was any truth to this rumor, or whether it was just slander invented by Henry's enemies. Nevertheless, other noblemen confronted Henry and demanded that his younger brother Alfonso be named successor instead of Joanna. This led to a military conflict between supporters of Alfonso and the supporters of King Henry. The battle was a draw. Henry agreed, however, to recognize Alfonso as his heir presumptive, provided that he would marry Princess Joanna, his half-niece. Alfonso died shortly after this was accomplished. He was only 14 years old. The cause of his death is not known, but it's speculated that he had contracted tuberculosis or the plague. It was rumored, however, that his political enemies had deliberately poisoned him. When he was finally named prince, Isabella had been recognized as his successor as well, which meant that she was the heir presumptive. This resulted in Isabella taking control of a rebellion that was growing against her older brother Henry. However, by this time, support for the rebellion was tiring out. Isabella entered negotiations to conclude the war. She met with her brother Henry and they reached a compromise. The war would stop. Henry would name Isabella as heir presumptive instead of Joanna, putting her into the direct line of the throne, and Isabella would not marry without Henry's consent. He would not, however, be able to force her to marry against her will. Henry attempted to arrange marriages for Isabella that would result in his daughter being placed back in line for the crown, but Isabella took matters into her own hands to marry her cousin, Ferdinand. By the time a formal betrothal took place, another obstacle arose. Laws existed prohibiting degrees of consanguinity, which, in other words, means that Isabella and Ferdinand may have been too closely related to be married. The only way around this was to receive a legal dispensation from the Pope. After this legal dispensation was received, Isabella eloped with Ferdinand, telling Henry that she was only going away to visit the tomb of her brother Alfonso. Ferdinand, for his part, entered Castile disguised as a servant, meeting Isabella on October 19th, 1469, and carrying out the secret marriage. Isabella proved herself to be an effective ruler in the decades to come. Her criminal and financial reforms, which have already been described, as well as the Reconquista, culminated in the expulsion of the Moors in 1492. In the same year, however, Isabella would agree to sponsor Christopher Columbus's expedition to the East Indies. For Christopher, this sponsorship did not come easily. He had already been seeking financial sponsorship for the last 8 years, first asking King John of Portugal. The king's advisors rejected it, correctly, on the grounds that Columbus's voyage had miscalculated the size of the Earth. The voyage he planned was in fact only a quarter of what it should have been. This was perhaps the result of his correspondence with Toscanelli, who had misrepresented the size of the Earth and the size of Asia in his letters to Christopher. In 1488, Christopher again visited King John of Portugal, and again he was rejected. The king, however, was very impressed with Christopher's idea. He secretly dispatched a caravel to sail around in that direction, hoping they would accidentally find the sea route that Christopher was hoping to discover. There's no evidence that this expedition ever took place, but it was licensed by the Portuguese king, and Christopher's son Fernando writes about it in his biography. He says that the men sailed around for many days until finally returning, and by that time they all thought that Christopher's ideas were laughable. Christopher sought an audience with Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand in 1486. Leaving his firstborn son Diego behind in Portugal, Christopher took a mistress in Castile, a 20-year-old orphan named Beatriz Enrique de Arana. Beatriz gave birth a year later, though unmarried, to Fernando, the future writer of Christopher's biography. He was actually named after the King of Aragon, Queen Isabella's husband. Despite not having married Beatriz, Christopher recognized Fernando as his legitimate son. Diego, his first son, would be sent to live with Beatriz and Fernando and go to school with the latter. Born in 1465, Beatriz was the daughter of prosperous farmers and owners of orchards, houses, and vineyards. She had one brother, Pedro, with whom she moved with her mother to Cordoba after the death of her father. Shortly afterwards, her mother died in 1471. Beatriz was 6. She and her brother were placed under the guardianship of her grandmother and aunt, where she received a decent education and learned to read and write, which was an exceptional accomplishment at that time for women of her condition, most of whom were unable to sign their names. In 1478, when Beatriz was 12, her grandmother and aunt both died, and Beatriz was sent to live with a distant relative. She met Christopher 10 years later when she was 22. It was during this time that Christopher presented his plans to Queen Isabella, who referred it to a committee. As with their counterparts in Portugal, they rejected the plans on the basis that Christopher had underestimated the distance to Asia. Their war against the Moors was also financially draining the kingdom. They were, however, intrigued by the idea, and to prevent Christopher from going to other monarchs while they investigated the matter further, they gave him an allowance of 14,000 maravedis a year, the annual salary of a sailor. He was also given food and lodging at no cost to himself. Evidently, they wanted to keep such ambitious men around. This effectively rendered Christopher an agent of the court. However, Christopher took his ideas to the other monarchs anyway. Unable to go himself, he sent his brother Bartholomew to King Henry VII of England. He was captured by pirates en route and only arrived in 1491. Stories say that he had lost all of his money, and according to Fernando, he appears to have been the only survivor. When he did get to England, he was broke, sick, and suffered. Eventually, he did gain an interview with Henry VII after gaining renown through his map-making. The experience of Bartholomew during these years is shrouded in mystery. According to some sources, he appears only to have been robbed by pirates, after which he continued on to England. In other sources, he appears to have been held captive for several years, arriving in England years later, after Columbus had already completed his first voyage. In any case, the story goes that after leaving England, he ended up in the French court where he was retained as a talented mapmaker, or so goes one version of events. Christopher's son Fernando mentions the pirates, which seems to lend a degree of credibility to this story, since it seems likely that Fernando would have had an opportunity of learning this anecdote directly from Bartholomew, his own uncle. Later, when Christopher finally succeeded in gaining sponsorship, however, Fernando appears to think that Bartholomew was still in England, not France. Fernando also says that King Henry agreed to the plan, which other sources contradict. This part of the story is messy and contradictory, and therefore students of history may have more work to do. In any case, what's absolutely certain is that by 1492, Christopher was living in the military camp of King Ferdinand. He was busy attempting to conquer Grenada, the final Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. The king and queen had terminated Christopher's retaining fee in 1498, and they had already rejected him a second time in 1490, citing the war in Grenada as a reason. According to Las Casas, the committee had judged his plan to be impossible and vain and worthy of rejection. The monarchs, however, were more encouraging. In 1491, he made yet another plea to them. Christopher, therefore, found himself waiting around in Ferdinand's military camp while their advisors discussed the matter. Once again, he was rejected. Fed up with the monarchs, Christopher made plans to leave Spain. He got on his mule and rode for Cordoba, planning to bring his ideas to France, where, according to some sources, his brother was staying. As he was leaving, however, the royal treasurer, Louis de Saint-Angel, heard of Christopher's plans and decided to intercede on his behalf. Louis de Saint-Angel was a third-generation converso, which meant that he was a converted Jew. His grandfather had converted to Christianity and thereafter began to prosper economically. During the Spanish Inquisition, which targeted and persecuted Jews, even converted ones, Saint-Angel and his family were protected. Ferdinand issued a royal decree that exempted Saint-Angel, his family, and all of his descendants from the Inquisition. It was believed that, despite their protection from the crown, Sant'Angelo still wanted to help Jews escape persecution in Spain. Historians speculate that he hoped, if Columbus discovered new lands, they would potentially offer the Jews safer places to reside. Indeed, after Christopher was granted the island of Jamaica, many Sephardic Jews took refuge there after their expulsion from Spain. Isabella was finally convinced. After years of frustration, Christopher finally had a sponsor. Christopher was given approximately 1.1 million maravedis, according to one source, with the other 600,000 provided by Christopher himself. Revealingly, Christopher stipulated in his contract that he would be given the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea, hinting at Christopher's lofty social ambitions. He would also be allowed to keep 1/10 of all riches acquired. He and his crew would be departing August 3rd, 1492, and unfortunately for him, things weren't going to go very smoothly. But this is a story for our next video.